All right, so I think we're ready. Okay, so we are, we're already pretty advanced. We did the first, the course overview, which was a separate kind of set of concepts in the class 1 and class 2, where we spoke about the basic tools of, representing music in a way that some digital device like a tracker could then run through and produce music. And as I said, trackers were already pretty advanced compared to the hard coding that people would do to notes as part of the code that would run on the early consoles. Today, I would like to go through the next step in the evolution of musical capabilities of games, which came from this incredibly powerful and maybe a little bit surprising but revolutionary way of creating sounds, so-called synthesis, sound synthesis. So what we'll talk about is so-called FM synthesis. The next step after FM synthesis was sampling, which was also kind of a technological evolution of the ability of computers to store and play back musical sounds. So in some sense, the big changes that happened to music of video games happened because of the advance in sound synthesis technology. We'll talk about MIDI and sound fonts, and these would be your main tasks for the next assignment as well, which which is published. I mean, they're all published before, but I mean, this is kind of like your clock starts ticking, if you want, on assignment 2, because you have like a week to submit this one. So what is FM synthesis, or what are the evolution? What happened with sound synthesis as game kept evolving? So the person who invented sound synthesis, he is actually a composer, also a computer scientist, a researcher in Stanford. And the FM stands for frequency modulation. It's a little bit mathematically tricky, and we're not going into any kind of explanation why this FM synthesis does whatever it does. But just to understand the acronym, so it's frequency modulation. So what it means modulated, well, maybe I've also seen in when you were playing with the other instruments, like with the beat invader, many musical synthesis instruments have these low frequency oscillators, or basically ways to modulate. Modulate means change in some way, in one waveform by some other waveform. So many times, like if you want to create some kind of wah-wah effect, right, you'll have kind of low frequency wah, wah, wah that can control either your amplitude, right, or if you want to have a pitch that goes up and down, whatever, sorry for my totally ridiculous way of making sound synthesis with my voice. But if you want a note go up and down, like what you do with a string, you would say you apply some modulation to the frequency of the note. But these are very slow modulations, okay? But kind of the concept of modulating something is basically taking one signal and using another signal to change it. Now, frequency modulation is a technique that actually changes the frequency of one note by another very fast frequency, okay? Now, FM existed before charting. It was a way to transmit radio. Okay, so modulation is also used in any communication, setting. Also when you have a modem in your house for the internet, it's modulator, demodulator. That's what modem stands for: modulating, demodulating. Because if you transmit information on electrical wires, on electromagnetic waves, you need to take something like sound, let's say, and you want to kind of modulate this. You want to take your radio wave and make some changes to that radio transmission and I'm not talking about digital transmission at this time, we're talking about analog, you need to change your radio wave by modulating this with a spoken or musical signal to be able to transmit this over radio, and then you demodulate this. So I'm really just talking about the concept of modulation. But the theory of FM was that you can encode something by fast change in the frequency of another signal. Okay, so this is when I say overall idea is that one frequency or a frequency of one waveform is modulated by another waveform fast enough. And the math showed that you can actually create very complex structures, very complex harmonic structures using this approach. So let me kind of zoom in a little bit. Yeah. So what is complex harmonic structure? You basically get timbre. Instead of talking about sine waves and triangular waves and square waves and the things that you were exploring in homework 1, now suddenly you have these hugely complex sounds which could be achieved by a very simple mathematical operation. Now, why was it so important? Well, it was because at that time, the only ways you could produce sounds was either creating a circuit that actually can generate these basic waveforms, or if you wanted something more complicated, you would start adding them together. And then the more complex waveforms you wanted, unless you were happy with the basic, these kind of mathematical manipulations that NES and the bit invader has, if you want something much more like realistic, sounding like a musical instrument, you would need to add a lot of sine waves, and it was very expensive. So Chowning started experimenting with modulation, at first just as a way to create very complex sounds. And this is an excerpt from his composition called Astria, where he uses FM synthesis just to create very complex electronic sounds. So I won't play this. This is a short piece. If you haven't listened to this type of electroacoustic electronic music, it might be a little strange for you at first. But I really encourage you kind of to go through this and kind of immerse a little bit in that world and think about the time that when in the 70s, when Chowning was working on these things, it was very hard to create such synthetic sounds that were totally new. So think about the excitement as if somebody was able suddenly to create these complex sound textures from these mathematical operations, and not like, oh, well, that sounds so familiar today, because people use these sounds all over the place and it doesn't maybe seem so complicated to us. But at that time, that was a revolution. So think about this as an abstract way, or how the math of FM allowed him to create very kind of waves or clusters of these sounds and very novel way of composing. So that became actually a major technological breakthrough, okay? And Yamaha actually licensed, it was patented by Stanford. It became actually the most profitable, at least that's where the story goes. I haven't checked exactly all Stanford patents, but the claim is it was one of the most profitable patents, at least until Google came along, because actually the patent for Google search is also owned by Stanford. So it was the biggest money maker in Stanford history, about 20 million. Now, there is an instrument in LMMS called Opulent Z, which is an emulation of one of the Yamaha chips, the YM3812, also known as OPL2. And this was a chip that's found its way into the first sound cards in the 90s, the Adlib and Sound Blaster. But these chips were also used in the game consoles, in the circuits for the game consoles. There is another instrument in LMMS called the Zinc Add Sub FX, which implements also additional methods, but also FM synthesis. So we will not cover, we're kind of trying to go through a lot of stuff technological, musical, artistic, but of course we want to talk about games eventually. So we will not really explore so much what FM synthesis is. We could have made another homework exercise with FM synthesis, but I do want to play a little example because FM really became now not so much a vintage, maybe some abstract FM is more of a vintage and experimental, but it allows us to create some sounds which are so typical in in dubstep, in a lot of club music. And here's an example of a sound that actually is, we're able to achieve with FM.
Voice parameters. We're gonna
let me just jump to some place where actually we can hear some of these examples.
0.75. Now parameter.
Okay, just a second.
Do the growl. This isn't going to do it because this is linear. Us. It isn't starting immediately. So if we turn the tension all.
So it explains how it's done. Sorry,
so
I think the example was.
Change button again. Just
okay,
this is where the fun
sorry.
begins. So with voice 2, we're going to go to the modulator, and we're going to.
So the modulator, it explains you how you actually play around with this.
Just a little bit lower than highest
okay,
value. Click on this miscellaneous tab, new instance of Zened sub effects. Now, if this is.
Yeah, sorry, that was right in the beginning. For some reason, Salvador was explaining this at the end. Here, listen to this example.
All right, so go ahead and open up a new project in Linux Multimedia.
So this is, so this kind of a very heavy modulated, this kind of growling bass is really something that is typical to FM synthesis, and it couldn't have been achieved without having some kind of a method that with simple controls, basically modulating few waveforms, you could create things that move from like tones, pure tones, to complex tones, to inharmonic tones that sound like this, and then you add modulation. So it's anything between like simple notes to chords, very abstract chords, to something that kind of growls and then moves back and forth if you modulate, if you change some of the synthesis parameters. Now, the next breakthrough was introduction of sampling. And one thing I kind of missed mentioning here is that one reason that also Yamaha became so interested in FM synthesis was not only that it could create very complex sounds, and these examples are maybe less representative of what the musical instrument synthesis is. This is an abstract sound example. This is maybe sounds to us familiar, but this is not a regular acoustical instrument. What actually John Chowning did when he patented this method was not the FM synthesis itself. It was a set of prescriptions of how you would manipulate or change the parameters of FM synthesis so it would sound as an existing musical instrument. So FM synthesis became a way to emulate in very computationally efficient way things like woodwind instruments, string instruments, brass instruments. You can also have inharmonic instruments, which means the instruments that have like a lot of pitches in them, which are not exactly sounding like a normal keyboard or like a normal string. Let's say gong. When you hit a gong, it resonates. It has kind of pitch, but it has a lot of it. It has like chord of pitches. So you can create these types of sounds with FM. So he actually made up or came up with a set of prescriptions of how you would synthesize sounds that sound like existing instruments with FM synthesis. So now you can create a keyboard that would sound like a piano, sound like a flute, sound like an oboe, name it. I mean, basically trumpets and gongs and stuff. So that was amazing because now you could kind of have more traditional musicians use FM synthesis and create synthetic sounds, which would not be chip tunes anymore. They might sound like, instruments they're used to. Of course, these were not perfect synthesis methods. So the next breakthrough came with sampling. In sampling, what sampling did was actually once the memory and the ability to record sounds on chips became available and the prices dropped, uh, it kind of went and you would think that it would totally crash or eliminate the wavetable synthesis, the FM synthesis. The fact it did not, because these methods have their own sound quality. Maybe today some of this is vintage value, some of this is just the expressivity of these sounds, right? But what sampling did, it said, well, we don't need to worry about creating these algorithms, these complicated mathematical formulas to make it sound as if it was a trumpet. We can record a trumpet. So this is what sampling is. You basically had short recordings of actual notes played by musical instruments, and you would store them in a memory and you would play them back. And now to create multiple notes, you would play this back either faster or slower. And this way, it's like with the turntable. If you play it faster, it goes up in pitch, goes slower, it goes down in pitch. Of course, it kind of distorts a little bit, so maybe you need to sample several different notes. You can just use one note going all over the keyboard. A lot of technical detail, but kind of the concept was that you can now recreate actual musical instruments without the need to create sophisticated electronic algorithms or circuits. So the first sampler instrument, the Fairlight computer music instrument, released in '79, and so on. I mean, basically, we suddenly had an ability to create sounds that sound almost like a real acoustic source. I mean, like the source of that acoustic instrument. So sound fonts in MIDI. Okay, this is kind of the last part of this module, and you will be using actually MIDI and sound fonts for the homework. So kind of before I jump here, maybe let me kind of summarize again what the take home message from this all of everything we've seen so far. So there was an evolution, sound synthesis, FM, super interesting techniques, interesting to listen to, expose yourself to this kind of a vocabulary of sounds, then think about the fact that it's still being used or actually very intensely used today with specific sound effects that you can create with it. And since you are getting familiar with LMMS, you might want to compose something with these sounds. But then once we move to sampling, we can now create musical instruments that sound like traditional ones. So our homework will be actually trying to orchestrate or take an existing recording and play around with the types of instrument that are assigned to different parts of that recording. So here are two new concepts. One is MIDI and MIDI file. MIDI stands for Musical Instruments Digital Interface. And this is something that started as just a communication protocol or a standard between synthesizers. So once we had these Yamahas, we had these chips that could synthesize things, you might want to build yourself a stack of different synthesizers. You might want to play on a keyboard and play the sounds from another module. So these things became very important in the sense of being able to communicate. So MIDI became a standard that tells you, like, if you press a keyboard, how you trigger a note on a synthesizer. Now, sound fonts became a way to standardize these templates of sounds, the samples. Okay, so going together, with MIDI or mod. Mod is slightly different formats. So you should read about this just to know what it is, because some games are using mods, and if one day you want to kind of integrate or compose something for a game that specifically uses a mod file, you might want to be aware of the difference between the two. But MIDI files are prevalent. I mean, you have a lot of MIDI files all over the place, and we'll be using one of them because people record now things and store them as MIDI files. But these are kind of like instructions. These are like scores. They're actually like notes that the synthesizer plays. So we have an explanation why we want to use MIDI and how it relates to game engines and synthesis. Okay, and the idea is that once you have a MIDI file, you have something which is recorded, you can still have a lot of flexibility. It's not a fixed recording. It's not an audio file. It's not a song that is performed and you can just listen to. You can start manipulating them. These are basically instructions for synthesis. So the reason for use MIDI and MIDI sequencers, and LMMS is a MIDI sequencer basically, and you can export your recordings as MIDI and not necessarily as WAV files. MIDI sequencers are really more highly evolved composition tools, gives you more possibilities to connect external hardware, and also this is very compact representation. These are basically notes. They can be sent across the internet, but also they're easily integrated into games. So I want you to be aware of what MIDI is and what a standard way of representing sounds as a general MIDI and sound font is. So in the games engine and synthesis, so for instance, Unity, which is a games engine, it's a software that allows you to program games. It will support MIDI, but also mode files, okay, created by specific programs like multi-tracker and mode block tracker. So actually mode files came with trackers, while MIDI files came more with sequencers. Usually games engines do not provide their own MIDI synthesizers. LES does provide MIDI synthesizer, Fmod does not. There's also audio kinetics. So, if somebody wants to go into the direction of really exploring the technology of the middleware, you might want to check and see what are the options. Can you use only recordings, the WAV files, or MIDI synthesizers? But the MIDI compositions from LLMS, you can actually export WAV files the way you did for the first exercise to use with any of the middleware. Again, we're not going to necessarily use middleware. It's just kind of a recommendation because we'll talk a lot about the middleware once we dive into really adaptive composition. We've seen what adaptive composition is, but we haven't done any exercises about adaptive composition. So this kind of concludes the overview of the development of sound synthesis, how it went from waveform to FM to sampling, and the idea that now you can actually store compositions either as mod or as MIDI files, and you can regenerate the audio or generate the audio from the notes, from the symbols that you encode with a variety of sounds. And this is where FM and sampling today, mostly sampling, allows you to do. I'll stop the recording of this part before I move to the next one. And